Sorry. Perfect.
No problem. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. All right, so the floor is yours now. I swear.
Oh yeah, no problem, no problem. So this presentation is called Terra Plaga, Invasive Threat Analysis and Considerations. That means Earth Pest. And I already introduced myself originally, but yeah, 15 years of IPM support, cannabis, gerbera, roses, lilies, peppers, tea. I spent some time in China too. I have an international sort of outlook on biosecurity, which we'll get into. New York State Cannabis Sativa Guidebook just came out in 2024 with Cornell, and I helped work on that. And I've had some other things that I've worked into as well. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, IPM in a way that is trying to be responsible with the environment, check out some of this information. Mostly, we'll be talking about three different topics here. We'll talk about sort of global connectivity and current, future ecological impacts that this has, what I like to call the Everswarm concept. And within that, we'll talk about sort of biosecurity and trade. I know a lot of people here either amend or work in sort of adjacent to soil or in agriculture, of course. So this is kind of where I'm gearing sort of the context. I'll be interested to get questions about various things related to that. I will also talk about invasion potential at a regional and global scale. We'll talk about the phyto-arthro microbiome dynamic and some of its implications, and some underappreciated things, mainly soil virome ecology, which is kind of interesting. Some research has come out talking about the movement of nutrients and things in the soil through them. And in an invasive context, like these things move so much, and other microbes too, what does this kind of mean? And when we talk about something like invasive. And then we'll talk about invasive earthworms, and in particular, the Asian jumping worm that I know has been on a lot of people's mind, but I thought it would give a greater context to North America because it's kind of interesting when you consider a little bit more info. So Everswarm concept, we have constant evolution happening all the time. And when I work with IPM, one of the things that I try to do is inculcate this idea that we're always producing selection pressures even if we're being organic, if we use regenerative practices, if we take sort of concepts and ideas from nature, well, these adaptations do happen. Um, for example, I usually use the beet leafhopper, the pea aphid, and the budworm moth as examples. These are all insects that have microbes in them that allow them to defend against things that we would use as biocontrols, even in sort of an intense sort of way that you wouldn't normally see in nature, like the predation pressure, putting a lot of predatory mites out, or certain microbes like BT and that kind of stuff. Um, and so basically, the bottom line up front is that we have like people, humans that can look at all these things together and kind of create a sort of multi-domain protection. So it's not enough to have like a one-dimensional thing because not only are the sort of microbes or insects or mice that we're looking at are not one-dimensional themselves, they also are going to be a, sort of a group. We can't just work on one or another. It's not a Bruce Lee flick that which I like to say, where the 20 guys come out, one after the other, and he honorably takes them out one by one. That's not people's experience. So we have to be sort of regionally, seasonally, and sort of adaptively contextual. Here's a map that I like to show, and if anyone saw me at the Soil Summit or if I met with anyone there, you might have seen some of these slides, which I think is really just interesting, which is this one depicts a Connex box moving across the world in a year. And we have in 421 days, my apologies, to the same port. 75,000 kilometers by ship, 5,000 kilometers by train, and 2,000 kilometers by road. That's pretty huge. And it reaches all these areas where, sort of trillions of dollars in USD anyway, is traded and moved around. It's a huge way that pests and frankly just other organisms, sometimes more innocuous than pest, move. For example, here we have depictions of ornamental floriculture and timber moving from Central America, mainly in the diagram A, to places like Western Europe, into China, into the Southeast Asia, and also Southeast Asia moving then into places like East Asia and China in particular. We've also got massive examples for the bottom, which is wood moving directly into China and South Asia, like India. So when these sorts of things happen, you have to consider that even when all of the continents were together, I'm trying to make this point, that, 500 million years ago, things still move faster than that. We have accelerated in a way that if I just said that it was accelerated, that's ambiguous. But if I put a real point on it, I think we can see exactly how, strong that effect is. Here's an example of like invasion costs. We talked about invasion biology. What is invasive? I actually, on purpose, didn't want to start with a definition of invasion, primarily because it really is context based. But I would say here, if we're really just talking about sort of ecological health, if things are going to affect the native ecosystem or affect the agriculture that we have, like in this diagram, I think that those would be negatives that we would want to sort of abate to some degree. But North America is a big one. If we go to A here, this is sort of invasion threat in general. So the southern part of South America, North America, northern and sort of central Western Europe, south part of Africa, Australia, and some other parts of Meganesia, and some small parts of Southeast Asia as well are big areas where we expect invasion of animals and plants to happen quite a bit. If we look at invasion costs as an aspect of GDP in these countries, though, that doesn't mean they're going to be affected very much. We go to C here, and we can see that only some of these countries are going to show it, at the highest level they were saying in this example. So my point here is that everyone's affected to some degree, and it does cost, even if you're a country that does not trade a whole lot, it does cost quite a bit. Strategic biosecurity failure affects you. Here is an example where some researchers found a bunch of exotic fungi on decorative wood used in aquaria and terrestria. So that's not great. Here is a diagram that shows that there's a convergence between exotic organisms not found in the USA, plant pathogens that are potential plant pathogens, although I will highlight here that the Fusarium and Penicillium species they have here, I'm surprised they said were potential pathogens because the species are definitely known as plant pathogens. So I would call them plant pathogens myself. Um, but they also have a bunch of wood decay fungi as well that some of them are maybe pathogenic, others are maybe more innocuous. Excuse me, at least as much as we can tell. So there's all these social effects. You can do everything right, is my point, and this can still befall you, right? So this could be regionally in your country, in your county, in your province, or it could be right next door. So these are the things is like we have to be very vigilant and we have to kind of assume that there are problems that might arise that even things that we can't or we don't suspect are going to happen. But that's sort of easier said than done. We have trade agreements going up, and I know that things in the world have been a little bit crazy lately, but I don't expect that the sort of gross or maybe net difference is going to be all that different. That is a pretty high hockey stick. We know that container and air freight is continuing to grow at a large rate. And we also know that there's a direct correlation between alien species and imports as a percent of GDP. So number goes up, and so this invasion possibility goes up. And maybe if even one, out of 100 or 1,000 turn out to be a problem for us, that's still like a lot of damage across, places, for example, North America. And I live in California, San Diego, so I'm particularly biased when it comes to things like citrus or avocados or things like that. I liked this research report, which I have cited here, talks about like the long and short-term effects that we might see with regards to different kinds of invasion. They have three examples here, which if I move this little thing here, I'll be able to actually read better for you. New Pangea, preserve or use, and conservation earth. And if you were to ask my personal opinion based on what I know, which is not comprehensive, but is certainly learned. I feel like we're moving quite a bit through the turquoise arrow here, new Pangea, if we don't do certain things differently. And I'm not sure that it will even matter compared to when we consider some of the trade that's going on. This is not supposed to be doom and gloom necessarily, but it is possible that some of these pockets and some of these examples of forests that we have, they're going to be threatened if we don't do something. And so there's a social aspect here. I hope and I know that most of the people that are here in this presentation are actively trying to affect change in that way, socially, through their business, or just holding sort of political groups responsible for keeping things good, and germane. Again, as a Californian, I see a lot of that myself. But this is the thing, like these effects that we endure now, we might not even see them, really crescendo until many decades in the future. Oh, sorry. Here we go. So we know the soil communities are quite complex. I wanted to take some time to talk about some of the underappreciated aspects of the microbiome. Most of us are very familiar with bacteria and fungi, perhaps archaea and protozoa and oomycetes, but I'm going to be talking a lot about viruses here because they're interest to me, and I think they kind of turn this sort of invasion biology thing, what I just talked about here, on its head. Because we can only consider the things that we can measure, right? And so I think that there needs to be a balance between like quantification, right, and practice. So all these microbes have effects on the plants, as this diagram adroitly states: defense changes, metabolic expression, your growth and your yield, morphology. Some of these we desire to affect in certain ways specifically, and we might even desire certain amendments, as I'm sure we're well aware, in order to do this. Some of these, though, communities are going to be, I guess the word would be hard to track, the phrase. So we know that we can track some of the effects that they might have, but we don't actually necessarily always know what's going on under the hood. It is a little bit of a black box, a black soil, perhaps. But we are aware of some effects that are much more pronounced, especially if we're doing some sort of a testing or something like that. And the technology to do this sort of a thing is becoming more and more democratized. So, if this sounds a little bit sci-fi or 30,000 feet in the air, it is a little bit at a strategic level. But we can't affect, we can't measure. I always find an excuse to put this diagram up, or these two diagrams rather, talking about something called the hologenome and the holobiont. If you're not familiar with the phrase, basically it's all of the genomes in yourself, a particular unit, a holobiont. So that could be a person's body, it could be a singular plant, it could be a singular bacterium. Depends on the scale that we're talking about. And we know that there's all these microbes sort of exogenous to us or to our plants. But then there is this sort of transitionary space. And it is within this space that I think we're going to see the most interesting dynamics, where we might find microbes that, become more, so they evolve under selection pressures, like in kitchenettes and in human domiciles and in hospitals. We know there's like nosocomial infections that we know that mostly only from hospitals, specifically because you were in a hospital. And we've known about these for centuries now. And it's possible that some of these bacteria, fungi, and other sorts of organisms might then, or have already, kind of introgressed into the ecosystem. Uh, I like to also mention that we know that some of these symbioses, especially like mutual fungal symbioses, have been around for quite a long time. But I just wanted to put a point on it with a really beautiful diagram that shows some of the earliest land plants like Aglaophyton and Horneophyton, which are, sort of barely vascular plants at this point. And we know we have examples from sort of genomic interactions, from fossil records, believe it or not, and other sorts of things that really confirm that we had arbuscular mycorrhizae even as early as these. And certainly they are known to be important for this sort of terrestrialization effect. But I guess what I really want to precisely punctuate, sorry about that, is that it is as far away as from the Devonian period, so like 500 million freaking years old. Come on. So the crop root microbiome, this domain that we consider, is composed of things that this research report talked about in the context of syncoms, which are synthetic communities, and natural coms, or natcoms. And synth comms don't necessarily mean things made in a lab or things like this, or that are in like sort of human or man-made sources. They are organisms that we specifically put together. So they're artificial in the sense that we might have taken them and specifically put them together, like for example, in a compost. This would still be a synthetic community. And in this research report, I think they bring up some really interesting points that we might consider, the sort of threat analysis that I'm talking about. There is limited understanding of what is in the compost that we have or the soils that we have. Limited only by our technology, not necessarily that we don't know very much. It's more of a case of what are some of these sort of like sort of dark deltas, so to speak, the things that we can't see because there's no way to find them, even if we know that it keeps the plants healthy and that sort of a thing. Sorry to be ambiguous in that way, but we also need to characterize better their functions. Sometimes it only takes a few genes for microbes to change, for viruses to change, for example, in their effects. They might become totally asymptomatic because they lack some sort of virulence gene or something like this. We also know that some pathogens descend, like powdery mildews, from soil fungi that started to like plant sugars a little too much. And I'm sure people are aware of some of these like sort of effects, right? We have priming effects we can get with plants in the bottom here. And as these microbial communities sort of evolve over short and long periods of time, we can get kind of stacking effects too. We can also get legacy effects in ecosystems that we're not tracking though, and that can cause effects that are just unforeseen. And if you live in some of these areas, you might be affected and not even realize it. Perhaps in a beneficial way, other times maybe in a negative way. All these historical examples of farmers with crops that just suddenly die, some of those cases might be extirpation events that we never even came across in the modern times now, like ancient times and things like this. But I think that there are like three main things that we should consider when it comes to the microbiome: the movement of genes between different microbes and also even our plants and sometimes even pests or beneficial organisms too. Those legacy effects I was just talking about, in forests and natural landscapes, fields, and that kind of a thing. And also the potential for some of these things to transmit into people. There's a paper that I read a long time ago called "Is it safe to go back in the water?" which is kind of a bold headline. And I was talking about how microbes from some of these places have been able to get into the ocean. And again, I'm a San Diegan, so I'm a little bit biased, and it maybe has affected my desire to swim sometimes, which maybe sounds, a little cowardly. Feel free, to debate that point. But it makes me think, makes me to consider. Um, I just love this research report because it kind of brings out some examples of, what do we know, what we don't know, and how technology can help us sort of get to that point and sort of accentuate what we already know, which I'm excited about. So this report basically went through a bunch of accessions, a bunch of samples from wheat, rice, maize, and medicago, which is like alfalfa. And they screened for different groups of bacteria and different groups of viruses. And what they discovered was a bunch of things that were never found in published records, a bunch of genera, a bunch of species. I think down here we have, yeah, they found 1,800 undefined bacterial species and something like, yeah, I didn't, 50, yeah, 1,500 plus unreported viral genera, many of which, 27% of which being phages, which affect bacteria. It's just a pretty diagram. I know that you will not be able to tell some of these lines here, but the most important lines to see here is this sort of outer ring. So each one of these lines I went and counted, is like about 1 pixel width, like one particular line. Some of these are very barely visible, even on the white background, unfortunately, even when I negatived it. But each one of these is, a novel bacteria. And you can see that they are they run the gamut of taxonomy that we associate with bacteria, especially in soil and plant domains. Another interesting sort of phylogenetic tree that goes over novel viruses found across these four groups. And yeah, I just feel like it's just so surprising to me. Maybe not surprising is the right word, but it just sort of like, I think it just shows her the vastness of what we're discovering. all the time. So this is mostly in the abstract. Hopefully you can appreciate it in this way with me. This diagram also shows a bunch of different sort of groups, different phyla, different families of bacteria that viruses were found in. But I mostly want to focus on this sort of group 5 here in the outer ring, because it shows the temperate and lytic viruses. If you're not familiar with these terms, this is a virus that, for temperate, it infects a bacteria and it kind of integrates into its genome. So it becomes part of the bacteria, so to speak, and it may give it new genes. Some people may be aware that the photosynthesis that we rely on from the ocean is augmented by bacteriophages that infect um, photosynthetic bacteria and actually cause them to be able to photosynthesize. Isn't that crazy? That means if that went away, we would be in a bad place. So anyways, with that sort of bombshell, temperate bacteriophages are these kinds of viruses, and then the lytic ones are those that lyse or kill the bacteria outright. There's a big diversity difference that I have here on the left, different journals, different groups, and sort of as I say here, the coverage of crop rhizosphere metagenomes as a percentage in these different groups, including all these published genomes that they backed. And then the CRBC is what they found. And you can see that if you were to make some sort of conclusion based on the average in like the published literature, we have here a big representation of rhizobiales, right? Oh, sorry. Yes, exactly. You might think that rhizobiales was the most common, but at least according to this, with these 4 different groups, it's quite a minority. So again, some of these, this is the advantage of some of these kinds of documentations. When I think of viruses, I often think of these nucleopolyhedroviruses or these granuloviruses. These are viruses that are naturally found infecting caterpillars like budworm moths, which we sometimes deal with in cannabis and other crops as well. And these are scanning electron um, microscope images of these kind of neatly shaped viruses. And if you're wondering where I'm going with this, we were going to transition to earthworms very quickly. These soil viruses are found quite abundantly per gram, and earthworms are actually a big mover of these soil viruses. These viruses get onto dust, they get into water, they get onto equipment and our shoes. I guarantee you that if you were to look at some accessions on the soles of your feet, you would find some. They get onto the wind, they get onto plants, and then water rains them down to the soil. So the 2 big reservoirs for these sort of soil and plant-based viruses or associated viruses are, of course, plants and soil. And oh, I actually meant to change the slide a bit, but this is an example of various viruses that infect insects. On the left here, we have the virus, not the full name, of course, because they always name them very weirdly, and just the magnanimity of viruses that we find in their detections per gram in the soil. A lot of big exponential numbers, which I did not text out. But they're in the soil, they're causing all these effects, and there's 3 main effects that I want to go over with you. There's a biological effect, there's a biological effect, a geological effect, and a chemistry effect. As we move from rhizosphere to detritosphere to the bulk soil, we see a change in the diversity and also a change in the biomass and activity. Mostly around the plant, you have more of the sort of activity, more nutrient exchange, that kind of thing. But what I thought was interesting was that they found, at least in this research report that this diagram comes from, a higher microbial diversity in the bulk soil, but less actual microbial biomass, less actual like amount of these microbes, but more diversity. So there's sort of a selection effect, what we sometimes call the rhizosphere effect. The next like 1 to 3 millimeters of soil and space around roots. But this is the most interesting slide. And how am I doing on time? Good. All right, cool.
We're good.
This is the most interesting slide to me. This is an estimate of viral contributions to soil carbon dynamics cited here. They estimate that the soil virus carbon pool, so the amount of viruses that make up carbon in the soil, is about 0.116 petagrams. One petagram is about 1 quintillion grams, or about 116 megatons. As an example, I was trying to look for things that would conceptually wrap my head around that. And apparently, the pyramids of Giza are about 6 megatons. So, a lot more of those per year. This is annual. And but their mediation, sorry, is way more than that, about 1185 megatons per year. So that's their ability to mediate the carbon in primarily bacteria, but other microbes too, is through three processes. The virus link, which is actually direct ingestion. Believe it or not, there are microbes moving around like certain protists that actually engulf and then dissolve viruses and then loose those contents. I think that's pretty impressive. Most people probably haven't heard of that before, at least when I talk about it with others. And I wonder if that could create biocontrols for viruses. That's kind of interesting concept. Maybe we'll find something in our compost. When I talk about this verification, it's not to get anybody in trouble necessarily. It's because there might be stuff that we've never even considered. So I'm just sharing this with us. The other two effects are the virus shunt, which is where microbial necromass becomes what they term here dissolved organic material and particulate organic material, and then that moves directly into microbiota. So kind of like the rhizophagy effect, but with viruses. And then the virus shuttle effect, which is when microbial necromass becomes what they call here recalcitrant dissolved organic matter or mineral associated organic matter, which in the diagram here we can see it kind of gets locked away more when this happens. And this thing here is what they call the microbial carbon pump. So microbial biomass, bacterial and fungal primarily, this gets churned away. Some of it becomes loose and then gets reused by microbes and plants, and then some of it becomes stored away. Pretty fascinating to me. And here's sort of a diagrammal example of this lytic and temperate infection process that I had mentioned. I only want to bring it up here just so that some people could have like an illustration. So A shows what microbial necromass movement would be if you had no viruses, which is perhaps some people's idea of this case, but in fact is not true. The lytic effect is when these phages come in, they encounter the bacteria, they infect it, they replicate inside of it, they destroy it, the nutrients are loosed. And then C here shows a lysogenic infection, like a temperate infection, where they infect the bacteria, they integrate into its genome, they replicate in this way through the bacteria, and this causes a delayed process. So CO2 and sort of the expiration of microbes of these bacteria, it's kind of like it's delayed, but over time, you actually get more of this sort of movement. So their processes are kind of slowed, but it actually causes the carbon movement to be more pronounced. Um, or I'm sorry, less pronounced, my mistake. And then we have this sort of slower cycling of carbon. The shunt and the shuttle dynamic is actually mediated a bit by soil chemistry. There are people probably on this panel that understand it way better than myself, and I will yield that to you. But I did want to bring this to your attention. If you find this research fascinating, please take a look at it. But they talk about how the shunt is dominated with things like sort of moisture and precipitation, this thing called extracellular polymeric substances, so the things created by microbes, primarily like polysaccharides, proteins, nucleic acids. So it's less associated with those, more associated with organic matter content in the substrate, and less with clay. And I'm not sure if this might also consider like soil quality. Everyone's quality is a little different, but I think you know where I'm going with this. And divalent cations too, so calcium and magnesium. Less effective with these. More effective with soil animal activity, so microarthropods and earthworms and things like this. Whereas the shuttle is dominated or less dominated by moisture, more dominated by EPS production and its aggregation, less with organic matter, more with clay content, divalent cations, and less with soil animal activity. So finally, we're going to talk about earthworms. Oh, sorry. Yeah, because I do rely a bit on the slides to make sure that I'm just pronouncing some of these words correctly. But we're going to talk first about earthworms over millennia in a very condensed form. Hopefully, I've been verbose but not garrulous. Earthworm origins are pretty old. They've been around since the Triassic period, about 200 million years. There are about 10,000 species documented. We're concerned with the lumbricids. There's about 670 species, and they're from the Cretaceous, about 125 million years ago. So they've still been around quite a bit. The most problematic ones, though, have been around even since before or around the Cretaceous impact that killed all the dinosaurs about 60 million years ago. In North America, our most important story starts around 20,000 years ago, where there was a large glacial sheet that covered over most of North America, what is now Canada. And this killed the earthworms, most of the earthworms that were in North America. Because if you didn't have the glaciation, you also had all this other like snow and those sorts of things. It was an Arctic wonderland and drier too. In the 1700s, human colonization brought a bunch of European earthworms, and then in the 1900s and 2000s up until now, most of the global trade vectors, Asian earthworms primarily. So it's been happening a long time. And actually, just today, Rosa Fernandez sent me this research report, which I saw on X, that shows something really interesting. Basically, that the genome arrangement of earthworms has changed rapidly in their movement from marine to freshwater to land environments. And two of these that they have in the bottom here, you can see that, and if you didn't know, leeches are in sort of they're worms too. So this sort of freshwater terrestrial movement at the bottom. These are all chromosomes, all of these white blocks that have numbers, and each line is like the movement of a gene to another part of the chromosome. So some of these lines get quite befuddled. In the very beginning, it's quite linear, even with their outgroups that are close. So the mollusks and the nematodes at the top. But then at the very bottom, you can see that there's been quite a bit of fragmentation and genetic rearrangement. Just weird to think about genes that way, I guess. But it shows us that these European and Asian earthworms have had a very short adaptation to really traumatic changes. But here is that glacial section that I was talking about. You can also see on the right here that not only did it get much of North America, it also wrapped around and got a lot of northern, sort of Western Europe as well. Here is an example of two different environments where there are epigeic earthworms that eat the topsoil and those that are not. On the left, we have a bunch of understory canopy, we have plants growing, and we have a topsoil. This is very common in North America, and this was the case in North America up until we got on the right a bunch of epigeic earthworms that come in and eat a bunch of the topsoil. You still have leaf litter and things like that, but a lot of the organic matter, seeds that would drop, and other sorts of things has been sort of cavitated. And I've come up with for this presentation alone a couple of mnemonics for understanding earthworms. It's based on my understanding of people's like reaction when they see these earthworms. So hopefully you can let me know if they kind of stick in your head. The first one is E, and that of course stands for epigeic earthworms erode edaphic environments especially. And then there's IE, which is aneic earthworms also erode edaphic environments ebulliently. So, you can have those yourself and let me know if they're useful for you. But these two groups, epigeic and aneic, they cause the topsoil degradation that I'm talking about here. And the comparison from the left in this figure to the right, you can see that it's quite a lot less diverse in this way. Some of the native, so we also have this thing called the drylosphere, drylo meaning drill from Latin. It is 2 to 8 millimeters in area below the surface soil top, and it's influenced by the secretions of earthworms primarily. Native tree species to North America that are affected include acer, which is maple, quercus, which is oak, betula, pinus, and populus, which are at least the latter two pine trees. And some of the plant species include, and I'm picking myself because I was going to put the common names. I only know viola violet, but we have uvularia, trillium, osmorrhiza, botricium, and aurelia. So you can look up those genera yourself, I suppose. This is recorded, right? So fortunately, people will be able to do this. Um, this is also really interesting too. So these earthworms, we mostly think of them as kind of taking soil in, consuming maybe organic matter too, and then sort of mixing it with microbes and then releasing it. And that is perhaps the more important bioturbation effect. That's what I thought too. But according to these researchers, this is not true. Actually, the primary bioturbation effect is primarily a mechanical process, simply them pushing their bodies into the soil and then expanding causes this sort of mixing. It's way more important according to them. Interesting. So particulate organic matter ingestion is a minority factor, and earthworm soil pressure limit is about 200 kilopascals. On the bottom left of this figure, we can see that depending on the kind of soil, the component, whether it's dry, medium, or wet, and also its pressure, we sort of reach an earthworm limit if it's maybe too wet and also too fine, or, for example. And we can also see that across Earth, we have, at least according to these researchers, majority dry, majority medium, majority wet regions, and fine and coarse substrates. I really like this diagram, despite being kind of complicated. It shows on the top, we have the sort of 200 kilopascal limit. So soils that have this like great pressure, which I assume is a factor of like their biogeochemistry, that's my understanding. um, is like, for example, mostly in northern Africa, parts of Mexico, big parts of like the arid parts of Australia, the Middle Eastern peninsula, places like this. This is where earthworm development is quite limited or totally absent. But we also have, for example, other metrics which are delineated here by latitude, and this is one of the reasons why I think it's really amazing that we have these sort of recorded presentations, because somebody can just pause right here and just take a gander. So I encourage people to do that who are watching afterwards. I don't expect you to take this all in 10 seconds. But we see that some of these constraints, and indeed all constraints, which is this sort of white line, it really sort of maximizes around like between 40 and like 15 degrees latitude. So a lot of people I know live in this area too. So you can expect that, like, obviously it's going to change depending on your region, but like for me, California is actually quite a big earthworm area. So, take a look at this map, see if you're in that area or if you know someone who is, and maybe that can advise them about the possibility for invasion of earthworms. But going back to North America, most native earthworms, so there are some, you might have heard that there are no native species, and I guess that's again like invasive, a bit of a speculative question. I think that it depends on how far back you go. But besides the most recent colonizations of humans, including Native American people groups, we have a lot of native soil feeders. So they're mostly soil feeders, they're not leaf litter feeders. um, and aliens are actually not typically soil feeders. They are mostly leaf litter and other organic matter feeders. Where the natives, they were more adapted to like tree and forest environments. You might know that the chestnut tree used to be really common until chestnut blight wiped it out, trillions of billions of trees. Because we brought in some chestnuts from Asia. So that just changed the whole landscape forever. And so we have, maybe for other reasons, these natives are affected, not just through displacement, but through other sort of man-made effects. And over on the right, we have a functional enrichment diagram, and California and much of the middle and sort of east area of the US finds pretty much no enrichment by these earthworms. This figure is really interesting. It's a relative alien species richness heat map. And what it serves to illustrate for me is that there's quite a bit of alien species richness in much of North America at this point. And this is mostly mediated by your mean annual temperature, carbonate soil surface, makes sense, right? Organic matter, annual precipitation, and your elevation heterogeneity. So if you're in a very heterogeneous place, you got a lot of ups and downs, it's more likely that you'll have that. Whereas if you are more flat, perhaps more arid, or I'm sorry, rather, yeah, then you're probably not going to encounter it as much. And so the places that have relatively low levels of alien species richness is actually in like kind of around Texas, it looks like, and Oklahoma, which I thought was sort of interesting. But it's been changing for a long time since the early 1900s to 2021 when the paper was published. We can see, and could you confirm for me, because when I did this presentation on a monitor, the bottom number of alien species blocks, those are visible, yes?
I can see him, yeah.
Yeah. So you can see that we've been tracking this kind of a thing for a long time, actually. And over time, like there's been an intensification in the West Coast and the Southeast as well. So, and in particular. And so if you are in these areas, you probably are already aware of this, but in case you're not, this sort of alien species movement, not surprising, Florida, Texas in like the Gulf of Mexico area, Veracruz, and sort of the West Coast, these are all places that have major traffic and a global movement. So I've outlined here, we have an example of a number of alien species across North America, number of native species across North America, and then sort of a total of them combined. So the major places where we see earthworms are Oregon, California, Texas, Veracruz, Georgia, Florida, and Tennessee that I've outlined, and you can check out the research yourself. So other areas that are less affected, or have sort of more natives even are California, Texas, Florida, Tennessee. So they have both. And now we go to talk about the Asian jumping worm, Amynthus agrestis. According to these researchers, it's not even the top 15 number of alien species as a factor of geographical range. I'm not going to say that people talking about it is like propaganda or fear mongering. I think that these professionals are actually very explicit and true in their statements of concern. But I wanted to bring back a little bit of interest in how if we look at other alien species compared to the Asian jumping worm, it still has a lot to go. Let's just put it that way. So some of these species that you might not have heard of actually that might be more relevant to your area are the trapezoid earthworm, the common earthworm, and the red wriggler, which I know a lot of people use for compost. And like I'm not blaming anyone if you use them or anything like that. I've used them. There's no guilt here. But it is for obvious reasons it gets escaped a lot, right? And then we have the other species here, which I did not delineate. This is a cool diagram to me because it shows the total earthworms here. Um, in this range, and we can see like, again, European earthworms. It did hockey stick quite a bit in the total range, but European earthworms got a head start, and then we got sort of more Asian earthworms coming in around 1950s. And this sort of segment that they've taken out, that they've put here, the sort of interception threshold, it's the number of interception events in the US, given like around from like before 1950s to maybe like the 1970s. And what was interesting to me was that there was a large intensification, in most of the months, the sort of like bright blue color, sort of earlier in the 1950s, and then it kind of sort of trails off. You can see the sort of uptick. And I imagine that part of that is because that's when a lot of global trade really hockey sticked, and especially in North America. And then, people just didn't have any sort of like, no one's worrying about earthworms in the ballast or whatever. Um, Movement, according to these researchers, is actually mostly through airplane travel, air travel, air cargo, probably. Um, and then next to that is shipping, and then next to that is unknown, and then next to that, or undefined, and next to that is cars or vehicle transport. What I want to say with this sort of like somewhat grainy, but I think illustrative connection of various points is that a lot of it is happening through things that's not the humble farmer necessarily, or the grower, the gardener, or the individual person. This is mostly things that are happening, external to us and what we're trying to do. And so, we need to, again, you know, understand why these things are happening, and maybe, if you're really concerned, talk to representatives and things like that, and try to support people who are trying to do things the right way, which I know a lot of people here on the panel are doing. All right, the Asian jumping earthworm. It's originally from Korea and Japan. It's an annual species in Vermont, and it's a prohibited species in Wisconsin, which means that perhaps there's some sort of legal responsibility if they find that you are tracking it down or transporting it, or or if you're found harboring it in some way. But I will look into that, and see if how much of this is sort of relevant to you, how agriculturally adjacent you are. I did try to get from Keisha a good idea of the audience and what people would be interested. So if that is relevant to you, please reach out or look further. Considered a forest pest. So its main problem is that it degrades the forest ecosystem, not necessarily an agricultural pest. It does outcompete even the European species, and it competes for resources with other decomposers in the forest. That's another main problem. So its main environs are deciduous forests, mixed deciduous or coniferous forests, mulch beds, raised beds, private and community gardens, and now I'm contradicting myself here, commercial agricultural spaces. So they are found in those as well. But what I was reading was that, this is like the major thing that things like the USDA and other groups are concerned about, because at least in the man sort of made areas, oh, sorry, that was the ad that we had before. Um, Half-Life fans, give me a thumbs up. But you might be wondering, hey, how are earthworm castings going to be a problem for the environment? Because usually they're considered a good thing. But the Asian jumping worm, if you didn't know, it causes this sort of like grainy coffee ground like soil as depicted here in this slide from a USDA representative. It's actually not got a lot of organic matter to it. It's been quite processed, and it kind of compacts a little bit, but not very much. It causes a lot of soil erosion. So that's sort of the main issue. Not only do the earthworms eat all this organic matter, but what they leave is not really like very usable for plants, and in fact causes like catastrophes in the movement and sliding of land. Whereas uninvaded soil has a sort of like larger organic mixture. It's not really sand-like, and it doesn't really get grainy. Sorry. But here are these sort of two different areas. We have no earthworms in Camel's Hump in Vermont, and then we have the forest invaded by the Asian jumping worm in Shelburne. We can see this massive difference. Now, when you have the Shelburne situation, unfortunately, there's not a lot of understory, which means bigger animals, mammals even, like deer, don't have something to forage on in winter, and that's kind of a problem. So here's a depiction of what that kind of looks like. And wouldn't you know it, Keisha decided that we would do this presentation here. We did, sorry. We together came to this agreement without knowing that it was Invasive Species Action Week, right before. Isn't that interesting? So if this is interesting to you, you can check out all of these cool environmental groups and organizations. Maybe you're already aware of them, and talk about invasivity and, what is or isn't invasive, and what you can do to stop things that are destructive to your local area. I think local, support is really underappreciated, just like those viruses I talked about. And with that is the end of the presentation.
That was so great, Matthew. I love
Yeah,
it.
thanks,
I'm
Matthew.
glad you reminded me that it's recorded, because I was trying to read you'd go forward and I was like, oh, I haven't finished with that graph yet. Thank you.
I'm sure there's gonna be quite a few people watching the replays going through,
Yeah,
because I mean,
definitely.
there's a huge density of information to get through, but it's good. I mean, that's the discussion.
Yeah, I love that.
It just
I'm
to
a
give
sucker
everybody.
for I'm a sucker for those diagrams because they look cool, and I also think they depict a lot. And so I'm like, hopefully people are seeing this like on a monitor, not
Right.
like projected out, and make use of the fact they can just press pause and look, maybe listen to what I said and then go back and go, huh, I'm in Bahrain,
Exactly.
Exactly.
Just to give a shout out to everybody, again, questions, go to the Q&A button down the very bottom of the screen and go ahead and put your questions in there. We're starting to get questions filling in, so that's fantastic. Before we jump into the Q&A, Matthew, if you can give me back host permissions. I will go ahead and share out, let's talk about the Compost Academy, and then we'll move right into the Q&A session. So let me give myself, I am the host. All right, let me share my screen real quick. Right, and you guys can see what I'm sharing, I'm assuming.
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So just quickly talk about the Compost Academy. We're coming up on our online soil mentorship program. And just to talk a little bit about it, we have weekly group live mentoring sessions. So it's a 13-week program, and every week we have a different topic that we talk about. And we encourage all of our students to show up online, kind of like this in webinar format, but it's very highly interactive. We talk about certain topics, and then we are going to dive into questions and really kind of explore where the students need to have some more understanding or really kind of discuss and talk things out. And then we have a weekly challenge that coincides with the discussion. So this is a lot of hands-on work, like making compost piles, making extracts, making teas, doing things like that. But I think probably one of the most important or probably the most powerful part is the dynamic group discussion. So it's an online forum kind of setup where we call it the learning circles. And it's just where, as you were going through your learning process and you are stumped by something or you want to share something and get the feedback from the rest of the community, it's a fantastic way to kind of further that discussion. And we found that our students really do get into a very good, deep discussions through this kind of part of the platform that we have. And then we could call or ad hoc meetups where we go in and instead of just talking it through in a forum, it's like, let's have a session where we all get online and just kind of really kind of work through that particular issue. And we've had a number of students that were like, I'm having trouble with this. Let's do a meetup and let's just kind of talk about it in depth. And then we also have access to our self-paced learning modules. So this is, you can learn on your own, go through and kind of look through these different mini modules that kind of talk about, oh, here how to make an extract. Here's how we start to gather your input materials for making compost and so forth. So it is coming up on July 24th is our first session. So if you're interested, go to compost.academy. And we do have an early bird discount. It ends on July 8th, and it's $1,100 for the early birds, and regular price is $1,300. Okay, I think we talked enough about our program. Let's jump back into the Q&A. Keisha, I haven't been paying attention. Do you want to ask the first question?
I'm paying attention, I promise. No, I got it right here. There is only one question so far. What does the jumping, Lisa, this is a question from Lisa. What does the jumping worms castings test like in pH or nitrogen?
I actually don't know.
Yeah. Interesting. It'd be interesting to see, differences, in quality, not quality, but the potential plant response to the castings coming out from the jumping worms versus other earthworms that are out there.
Our experience so
I
far is
agree with that.
it's like when people see the worms, they're different. When you see a jumping worm, it gives you a little bit of a different vibe than other worms. I think that's how people first notice them. They feel a little bit tougher, the skin, they wiggle around and thrash more. And when you look it up online, like I mean, immediately it's just like you have the worst pest on your property. So for us, I think most of the people that we know that have experience with it haven't been keeping them to break down organic material or working with them in any way. So yeah, I've only seen, terror messages about these worms. I haven't seen anyone trying to compare, what the nutrient benefits or the pH values might be. I on my own, I mean, I have not really questions, but I have a bunch of notes as Matthew was talking, the things that I really wanted to discuss more in detail. And I guess if we're talking about the worms, I think it's really interesting that the European nightcrawler is so high up on the list, the problem
Yeah.
list.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. I
What?
thought that was interesting too.
How did we
I
not know
guess because
that
of all the
already?
anglers, right?
Yeah,
Well,
that's
yeah.
true, right? Yeah, they dump in their spent, not used worms just right there in the forest and so forth.
Well, my whole life growing up, I mean, I can remember great grandparents being like, you dig into the soil and you know it's good when there's worms there. Like people have an association with these European night crawlers. I guess all these species I'm not familiar with at all, but for us, I think as humans in North America, as far as I know, we've always see the worms and we go, man, that's a good thing. So that's
Right.
really eye-opening to understand that the common worms that I see all the time in my garden or, anywhere I've lived in the US, except for the desert, could be causing a bigger problem than benefit because that just wasn't it just wasn't what I thought at that time, I guess.
And I think it's a contextual kind of thing too, right? Because when you see the earthworms in those kind of native forest lands, that's the problem. When you tend to see them in agricultural spaces, garden beds, things like that, we always relate to them as saying, ah, that's a positive. That's showing that there's life. In fact, when you start to doing that kind of restoration aspect of, like, say, an agricultural field or your garden beds type of thing, it's always one of those kind of signs to us that, oh, the ecosystem starting to come back is because of the worms. We're starting to see castings and things like that. So it's a weird context switching thing that has to happen, which is like it's not everywhere, that's a benefit necessarily, right?
Is it a good thing or a bad? I think it puts me in the correct headspace. That I couldn't get there with the jumping worms. I haven't had them. They haven't been my problem yet. I've had other
Right,
problems.
right.
I got stressed out about other invasive pests when I started thinking about jumping worms. But it was it's interesting the slide that Matthew showed about California. So that we have more native earthworms and more invasive species living at the same time. So it's like, and the first chart I saw, I was like, oh yeah, California, it is a hub for invasive species. I know that. That's my work. And then the next chart's just like, and then the native species are just, as abundant there. And I was like, okay, so they're living side by side. Like, how evil are these worms? And I think that's where it's always hard for me, or I suppose it would be for anyone to say, like, how bad is this guy? You
Right.
know?
Yeah, and again, probably context again.
Well,
And
and
that's it.
what would we do to get rid of them at this point? Do we just nuke
Yeah, there's
this?
no answer. Yeah, so I was thinking someone would ask that question. Yeah, so like let me adjust myself a bit here. I looked, of course, being an IPM guy, I looked up like, well, they've been here a while. What do we do? Nothing. Apparently there's not really a big solution. Some people use like if you're gardening or if you're like small scale, I imagine, small being a contextual word too, but if you have the logistical fortitude, you can apply, like, there's like mustard, liquid that people make. They like boil like mustard seed or like or whatever, or use ground mustard, like effluent to they put in the soil, and then the earthworms are very agitated by this, and they'll come out, and you can kill them or collect them or repurpose them in some way. But like, I don't think that's going to be happening in the old growth forests. And
Sure.
the other thing that people have used is like a literal, like, burn, technique, where you just burn the ground and it gets hot and it kills them. But obviously that's going to have some repercussions too, especially in California. There,
Right.
like sometimes there's not an answer. This is also something I see, like, in the cannabis space. People ask, "How do I get rid of this problem?" And sometimes I'm like, "Well, I don't have anything I can recommend to you." Literally, it's like no one's considered it yet. So it's unfortunate that this hasn't been prioritized more. I imagine there are solutions that are out there, but yeah.
And I think this is, kind of really one of the driving factors of having this discussion. And why this really came about was one of our students was making compost, and the compost, some of the input materials that she received had Asian jumping worms, but when she made the final compost, Asian jumping worms were present. And who knows if it came from already on our land or came from input materials coming in and infecting that sense. But the question really that came down to is, what do we do? Do we not use that compost? Do we not sell it? Do we not, transport it? Am I being a vector to infect other areas with these invasive worms? Or is there already nothing I can really do about it? And is the invasive worm issue kind of moot at that point as far as reinfecting or broadcasting that invasiveness, right? And that is the crux of the issue. I think it's almost like a risk mitigation kind of thing. You have all these pros and cons that you're trying to weigh, which is if I'm not doing the good work I'm doing to do restoration because I'm held off because of A's and jumping worms, what else am I not, as far as the restoration aspect occurring? But if I move this compost to somewhere else that doesn't, it may not have had that jumping worm, now have I infected that area and propagated that invasive species? That's that balancing question. I think is so difficult to answer, to be honest with you.
That's why I tried to couch. I completely agree. I think you have actually done it. That is the crystallized messages. That's why I kind of did all this stuff with the viruses and the bacteria and stuff, mostly because those research reports showed what we didn't see.
Right.
More importantly, the big concept there in abstract. So what are we doing? And also maybe what does it matter in some cases too? It's a really good question. And I think that for these earthworms in particular, my personal opinion, I guess it's also my professional opinion, is that like if you're like in a capacity where you're more likely to vector it like through soil amendments or maybe like compost or something like that. I feel like, well, first of all, before it becomes like an ethical question or an ecological morality question, it becomes, maybe there's a business question that's further along, which is like, will I get in trouble? Because I
Right.
won't be able to do my work if I get lambasted.
Yeah.
So there's that. Whether you agree with it or not, there's this level, and then after that, I think it's a question of like, I would try to be vigilant. I would try to not I would try to like, I would maybe like, doesn't mean you have to like get rid of everything. Perhaps there is a middle ground between these two extremes, but I think that I feel like, maybe you could try to introduce like a global quarantine or something, but it is hard because their cocoons are hard to detect. I didn't
Right.
even go into their life cycle or whatever. Because I was trying to keep a big concept. But I think that like people, I think it would be good if people were aware of them and tried to like mitigate them if they are, producing these things. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe you'll send to a place that has not that's already has them. Perhaps it won't matter. Or like some of these red wrigglers too. It doesn't have to be just the Asian jumping worm.
For sure. And I mean, and when you think about, one of our prime tools that we use is compost, right? That is one of the prime vehicles that we do our inoculations, able to bring, microbes back into areas that don't necessarily have that diversity or biomass of microbes. Well, making compost, try to keep worms out of them. Good luck, right?
I don't mean to interrupt, but I actually
Yeah.
there's a point about that also links with Keisha. I just want to make this point apparent because I think you're kind of referencing it too. Is that like I said earlier, like the chestnut tree thing is not a joke. Like billions of trees, like the continent was very different, not more than like a few hundred years ago. Okay, and it's like it's less than a blink of an eye. So like what hill are we dying on? I also want to make that point too, like what you're saying here is that like, you know, uh what is the new natural is perhaps different, like I'm
Yeah.
not going to tell people like what you restore, like what does restoration mean too, like 100 years
Mhm.
from now, 200 years
Right.
before, for like you said, I've always known earthworms and it's still in my head, like I've done this whole presentation, I know it, I have the curse of knowledge, and I'm still going to be like earthworms are not, not beneficial to my mind even though
Right.
in North
Right.
America.
I find it
Exactly.
funny too that I see there's questions pouring in now. We'll get to really soon, but you brought up the mustard, and Ryan brought up Jeremy Silva, Build a Soil, puts a lot of good information out. He talks about using mustard. Um, and immediately I was like, what is our arch nemesis in Southern California? The mustard plant. We could collect the mustard off the hills. We could put it into some sort of powdered form and we could sell it to get rid of the invasive worms. If only there was the time and the money, and yeah, like what hill are we going to die on with this? What is restoration? You know, this is our job all the time. I mean, we go in and I catch myself sometimes even when I'm talking about like, oh, I've regenerated this soil. And I'm like, I mean, have I regenerated it? I've changed it. Have I restored it to what it's supposed to be? even when I use native plants and compost, they work well with the earthworms. And I guess that kind of pushes into Mark brought up a question. He says, how have plant species in Korea adapted successfully with jumping worms? And how long would it take for our native species to adapt? How can we help our forests prepare for the eventual arrival of jumpers?
Oh, great question. I think it is just like Brian's question just now. It is the question, like number two here is so like the first thing is I'm not an expert on their ecology, but I think I have a guess I'll hazard, which is that um like in a lot of parts of Eastern Asia and also in Korea, I know that it can be quite mountainous. And so I wonder if part of it is because a lot of plant life is, I mean, it depends on the plants we're talking about, but perhaps there are a lot of plants that live in like kind of pockets essentially where there's a lot of like what is essentially rock that the earthworms can't exist in. Maybe that has like a fragmentary effect, but that's just speculation. Um, as far as how long it will take for our native species to adapt, I think that fundamentally, like the plants being what they are, I think they would have to change very fundamentally to adapt in this way. Like to them, it's more like I mean, it's like what I say when I talk about like ants. Like everything that's had to live has had to survive through an ant filter. Especially like army ants moving around, eating everything on if you couldn't like fly away or move away or kill them, you're dead. Um, so in this way, like plants that are able to survive, like you saw in those diagrams, large trees, they've already established maybe their seedlings. Most of them maybe don't germinate, and that's a selection pressure. But a lot of those plants are just not there anymore.
Yeah.
Also, if we're talking about being like just completely panicked about forest health, like how will our forests survive us? Here where I live in Gold Country, California, a lot of people come here on vacation. They look around like, wow, you live in such beautiful, gorgeous, natural, native forests. And nope, no, our forests unfortunately have been completely clear cut twice. We don't have old growth trees here unless the miners couldn't get to them. If they were too hard to pull out of a canyon, there might be old growth. Same where I grew up in Missouri, in the Ozarks, one of the most beautiful parts of the country you'll see. And to my mind, it's like, oh, this is beautiful wild land. And no, it's baby forest. So all of those forests had been cut and used already. And I don't know, in California, the picture that Matthew showed about the forest that had been invaded by the worms, that's what we want to see here in California because we're really concerned about fire. So there's a lot of conversations to talk about. Like, we're actually not really allowed to have plants growing in the forest in California because that's fodder for more fires. And is that the way it should be? It's all human cultivated at this point. The trees that are planted, people planted them. They decided they would be there. We don't have the great diversity of native species that we used to. And understory plants are evil in the eyes of the forest caretakers that we have now. And I spend a lot of my career trying to talk to the Forest Service and saying, hey, maybe broadcasting glyphosate over our forests and our pasture lands isn't a good way to deal with invasive species. But this is a big tangled ball of mess that, like, it's not just the worms that are messing it up.
No doubt. And I think also that, I think Matthew, you had a slide that kind of really put a point to this, was the speed at which the invasiveness happens, right? How, because of our human technology and the way we're able to travel at such distances so quickly, that the rate of invasive, introduction of these invasive species is just accelerated hugely. You add climate change on top of that. I mean, we're at a period now, the climate is changing so fast. The human impact on our ecosystems is compounding and compounding and compounding, right? And that's a hard thing to deal with, to be honest with you. And there's no good answer to this, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, it's certainly not going to be, an individual's not going to come up and go, aha, I have it, and cut the Gordian knot in half. I don't think that's the case.
Right.
But you make a great point there, Brian, and also you, Keisha. Like, I feel like for me, it's when you bring up like the oak trees, for example. I live in Southern California, and I see those oak trees, and we're getting shot hole borer. The climate's really bad for them. A lot of them are emerald ash borer too. I grew up. I was in the Boy Scouts when I was a kid. I hiked Yosemite. I went up Half Dome at like 14. On the little like the like vertical ladder. Anyways, my point is that I've always been very close to these areas, on the West Coast, Mount Whitney, all these places, and it's just terrible to think that like we probably could do more, but no one prioritizes it, and even the millions of dollars with an M that we use still isn't enough.
Right.
So,
And there's a point that Christina had put it into the chat. I just want to bring this up. She says,
Thank you.
so
I
I'm
was gonna
hearing
say
that our precious earthworm castings from our red regular kitchen scrap bins are not actually good for the soil. And I
oh
think,
no, no,
yeah,
well, okay, yeah, go, go, go.
I was
Yeah.
just going to say that, again, it's the context. Those worms may not be good for some of the NATO ecosystems, but it's not like they don't provide a benefit to the soil and or a benefit to the work that we do, right?
yeah, it was
I
also
would
brought up
agree with that. I would
those
agree with
worms
that
that
characterization.
like all of those worms, Christina, have been here for a very, 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 very long time. So
Yeah. I'm not giving up my vermicast. I mean, my vermicomposting systems for sure. There's no way. I mean, they're a tool that we are able to use, and they provide a really good role in, you know, making inoculums are very good. All the compounds that come out of those vermicasts have been fantastic for the work that we do. It's just in the context of a natural ecosystem, some of our natural ecosystems, yeah, they can be very problematic.
I think
I
we're
feel
trying
like
to
it's a
say,
difference between like having like a dog and having like like the invasive screwworm that comes in from like South America and like kills all our cows, right? Like so I would agree. I want to echo that statement very precisely. Like, yeah, red wrigglers are not like the Asian jumping worms. They are from Asia and they do destroy the understory and the organic matter in forests and stuff, but they don't actually ruin the soil. That's what makes the Asian jumping worms particularly nasty, is that it upends things in the ways that the other ones at least don't quite do so
Right.
directly.
yeah, that kind of answers Ryan had asked a question. I was curious if their castings are beneficial as well, and or how they are a threat to the environment. Could they be an evolution step to further the climate change to a new food source? Guess I would like to think they are a solution to a missing link optimism. Yeah. I think there's a lot of different ways we can think about it, Ryan. The point of this conversation is just to have the conversation, to open it up and make it a little bit less scary. I think, I mean, that's like a lot of us are doing this work. Matthew's a person that's out there working every day in integrated pest management. Like that's how he runs his life, right? And Brian and I and Casey and Raleigh, all these people, we're out here doing this work. But if you're planning on doing this work, even at your own house, like these are the things that are going to come up. And it's like, it can be scary. You get on Google and it's just like everything you thought was good is now bad and you are ruining the environment. And I think it's really easy to like get a little nervous about it. It's like the one thing that ties all of us together, no matter who we are, where we're coming from in the world. We're all here because we either like bugs and are interested in just in plants, or we love soil. That's what binds us. And so the idea that we might be doing something that's like hurting our beloved ecosystems, like yeah, it can cause
It's
a lot of anxiety.
for sure. And don't doom scroll because it's really easy to do.
Yeah.
And it's going to be the
Yeah.
people who care the most that worry the most, and perhaps the people
Yeah,
who we want to be most like indurated against problems,
right.
so it's kind of ironic that like we are like like double vulnerable. I think the people on the panel, you two as well as me,
Yeah.
like I I bring this up with my friends and they're gonna be like, I don't really care.
Care.
um
Yeah.
let's play some
Boy, I
No
heard that
Man's
a few
Sky or
times.
something. Okay, the environment.
Like, here you go again.
Oh, I
No,
get that all the time. The eye roll. Oh
it
no, here
is
we
true
go.
though. I mean, the our student that was the most worried about it is the student that's doing the most work to spread knowledge, doing the most, having workshops, building compost every week, just like enlivening the community. And it's like, you're right. It's like the people that are really caring the most, that are doing the most, are going to be more likely to be stopped in their tracks by this kind of stuff. So this information sharing is, I think it's important. Um, Christina had another question. I'm alarmed because there aren't earthworms in my garden soil. What kind would ideally be there? Well, it depends on where you live, Christina. And after what Matthew showed, there's so many more species. Now I'm like kind of wanting to collect the worms in my soil and like
You probably won't
try
be
to
able
pull
to
up.
tell the difference too. Like, I'll
Yeah,
be
right,
honest.
Matthew, what
I'm not trying
species
to
of
set
worm?
unrealistic expectations here or anything.
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah.
that's an Alaskan bullworm, like that's
Right.
not yeah.
We
So
can't help
that's another
ourselves.
factor too, right?
Well, yeah,
I'm
and
just
I feel
saying
like
beware of what? I'm not sure always. That's the message.
well, it's like microbes are always trying to figure out, what species of nematode is that? And I was literally in my yard the other day, and this bird, I was trying to describe a bird to my mom, and I realized like I don't even know the species of birds. Like I could very easily know who you are, and I have no idea. I was like, it's a small yellow bird with a red spot. I'm like, I don't even know what birds are in my yard. Why am I trying to figure out the species
It's
of bird?
probably called like a little yellow lake spot bird or something. Like some of these names are pretty descriptive and other times sort of nonsensical, thanks to Britain, for a lot of those, is my understanding. I actually wanted to answer a question here talking about, it's well, I want to also echo sort of Christina's question here too, like what would ideally be there, but also sort of Mark's here about impact of fungus and bacteria ratios and things like this. So I feel like basically like I think if you could take two approaches. One is the radical like, okay, well, I know I can't like control the earthworms in my soil really. But maybe if you want, if you, for example, I know I've done it, you can get red wrigglers ordered to your door, night crawlers to your door. I'm not going to stop that. There's nothing I can do or anyone else can do. But if you can contain it, perhaps I would say that would be reasonable and nice, and perhaps it would keep from spillover in the same way that you wouldn't like, maybe you've been taught to not release goldfish into the lakes, or African frogs, a big one in the sewer system here in California. We used to have a frog pond at where I lived at the exit of a sewer duct, and there were a lot of these frogs there. That's why they called it that. So yeah, like I would just say be like cognizant of that kind of a thing. I'm not expecting to be a superhero, but yeah, maybe just if you're gonna use them, like keep them secluded, or like have like what Brian was talking. I'm sure you have like a vermicompost system. It's not helpful for you if they leave the container, right? You want to kind of concentrate with black soldier fly larvae. Those are not earthworms, but like that sort of similar idea of, okay, I've got meat waste. I can't really put that anywhere else. Give it to the flies, the larvae. Oh, I got vegetable matter and that kind of stuff, plant matter. Give it to the earthworms. I think that's way better, and I would highly recommend
Yeah.
Also on the F to B ratio thing, it's like we are educated in this F to B ratio, that whole language that came with Elaine Ingham. Like no, there wasn't just common folks walking around every day like curious about the fungal to bacterial ratio of soil until they met Dr. Elaine. So that's so new. And you have to understand as well, like there's not like science isn't just like let's check in on everything she said and just start to use this fungal to bacterial ratio idea to counter and check everything else we do, right? So oftentimes there isn't, if Elaine taught me anything, it's that the questions that I have are not answered yet. Like it's very easy to come up with a smart question that nobody knows the answer to. And I can see a lot of
that.
those here where I'm just like, wow, yeah, like I think you're supposed to say as soon as we have the funding, we would love to work on that project.
Yeah, that's right. That's true. Yeah, like why don't you put another colon there and put V for virus? Like that was like half of this presentation, that was kind of that was a big part of this point is like, yeah, there's multitudes that are affected, for sure. And man, like the carbon thing just blew my mind. That's why I had to include it, because like I know we're always talking about organic matter, and that's literally, we can, but imagine we're making measurements without considering the viruses. So in some ways you could make the argument that we do know like input goes in here, output comes out here with these metrics, which is very valid. But now we know like another fragment, another section of that pie chart that just wasn't there before, and I think that's valid. And I wonder how much that's going to affect things like, bacteria in the soil, but also like, I don't know, how often do you think bacteriophages get into your own body. Like they're in your body right now in your gut.
Right now.
There's a
Yeah.
That's
ton that are
insane.
regulating the bacteria in your gut right now. And
Yeah.
I wonder how many of them are exogenous originally from humans, like when you're a kid or a baby, like
Right.
Right. Well,
right?
and I was
What?
wondering too, when you were talking about I've always assumed this. I didn't know that protozoa ate viruses, but I assumed they did. But I was when I was really new to microscope work, and someone on Instagram posted a picture of a white blood cell doing what white blood cells do, attacking foreign things in the body. And I literally argued with them. I was like, "That is a naked amoeba," and they're like, "Check yourself. This is a white blood cell." But they look exactly the same. You really can't tell them apart. And so the idea that like you can take a drop of blood and look at it under a microscope and see what looks like protozoa eating foreign things. You can literally take a drop of blood and put some stuff in it and watch the white blood cells eat that stuff. Of course, it must happen in soil. It's the mirror between the two. I'm excited about that kind of research.
Yeah, and I
Well,
think
and
there's no accident there.
right.
Why the white blood cell is a lot like an amoeba. There's a lot of conversion evolution. Brian was probably going to say something super interesting though.
Well, yeah, all I was going to mention is that I think it's, forums like this that we're talking about, helping us demystify, like if you talk to a layman, somebody who really doesn't know much about soil biology or anything else like that, and you start talking about bacteria, most people's impression or reaction to the word bacteria is a negative thing, right? It's like, oh, this is bad, this is detrimental. Virus, this is the same way. A virus, it's bad, it's got to be removed, killed, eradicated, that type of thing. It's just having these discussions, bringing knowledge and saying, no, it's not as simple as that. There are many roles and functions that bacteria and viruses and other things play that are extraordinarily important to making a functioning ecosystem work. Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the viruses thing in particular. I was like super jazzed. I was like, yes, viruses
I'm
get some of the
glad.
some light. Woohoo.
Yeah, I'm glad for that. I just think it's like like you said, like that's like plant pathology's whole it's like their whole history is like pathogens were obvious, plant die, not good, we care about this, but like now there's like viruses in plants. You do an accession, there's viruses, tons of them, no symptoms.
Right.
Are they a carrier? Are some cases are even beneficial? I didn't bring up the curvularia virus, that it's a virus in a fungus that infects a plant that allows the salt grass to survive really hot water temperatures. And
Wow.
if the plant doesn't have the fungus that has the virus of a particular strain, it doesn't work and
Doesn't work
dies.
right. Yeah,
It's an
it's so
upgrade, it's a
wild.
genetic upgrade,
Yeah.
basically.
And how much of that evolution was the co-evolution of those organisms evolving together, right? That always just blows my mind. Yeah, how sophisticated these systems actually are.
And speaking of questions that are really easy to make, that stumps the chump, we have Mark here with, what is the biggest problem with the IPM model? He asked the IPM guy. No, actually, I think it's a really great question. Um, I think that, like, I'm not sure what is meant by model here, but I will say that, like, the domain, I think that for a long time, if the history of IPM is maybe a little bit over 50 years old, maybe give or take plus minus 20. But like ecological concepts pre-existed, they inform it. I think that the problems that IPM has is probably related to the same thing that we have for like research in general, just not knowing certain things. And I think that also for some people, their concept of IPM is like to spray something or whatever. And, I don't think that's appropriate. You definitely want a holistic perspective, like we did here in the presentation. And a lot of it is also, I would say, like when people do create an IPM program or a system, I think that if you don't fundamentally recognize it's like physical security or cyber security. It's like any kind of emergency thing. Like the whole point is, first of all, you take steps to not have the problem. And then if you do have the problem, you hopefully have a plan for making sure it doesn't become an emergency. So a lot of things have had to mess up, hopefully, before you get to a huge issue. And that's sometimes eschewed because people think that like they just won't have a problem this time. And I don't think that's an appropriate. I think it's a deeply unserious perspective here.
The wishful thinking aspect. Well, I know we're getting up to the end of the let's take one more question. We'll make it go just a few minutes longer if that's all right with
Sure.
everybody. Let's see. There was a question. Um, let's see. There was a couple questions from Citros, and the questions were: How long do worms stay in compost, and is dry compost essential to the soil? So,
I'll go with that one.
yeah, I was gonna say, Keisha, right up your alley there.
Yeah, again, like it's not the worms that make anything viable or not viable. It You could have worms in compost or not have worms in compost and have wonderful compost. Moisture is important always, I find. Um, Compost needs to be moist at least at some point to break down. So decomposition is driven by moisture and microbial activity. So I guess there's two different things going on here, but I found that worms can live in compost for a very long time. With thermophilic compost, often the temperatures are going to kill most all of the living worms or push them out. They can leave, so they can come to the cover. They can possibly move across our compost pad, which is quite dry. But I suspect they get eaten by a lot of things. But the cysts of the European night crawlers, I don't think they're necessarily killed with heat. Maybe they are, but
I was
I
gonna
mean,
ask, do you ever see them like dead in the compost? Like
I've never seen after the hot cycle, I don't see a lot of cysts. I don't see any worms, but as if just like one day a switch is flipped, they're there. And like, it's the same as the millipedes and the centipedes. Like if somebody, like we now have our compost reliably always has millipedes and centipedes, and they hunt, sometimes they crawl out of the bag. Like it's terrifying. And some people, they don't like it. It's a complaint we get, like, why are there baby millipedes in my bag? Well, because a mommy laid eggs there. Get rid of them. There's no way. And
I
it
know,
doesn't,
I think that's valid.
and right after it's went through its heating cycle, sure, like everybody's gone, but then they show up. And so how they show up, where those eggs came from, I have no idea, actually. Because if you read the literature, it says they should be dead at that temperature. If I'm cooking up around 165 degrees Fahrenheit for, for between 131 and 170 for 14 days, everything should be gone and dead, but it's not. So, the fungi still exist, the nematodes are still there, the protozoa are there, the microarthropods even sometimes stick around. And so I don't know, we don't have all the answers yet of why, how long. But yeah, worms not in compost can be great. It could be super
Right.
high quality compost with worms in it, great quality. Yeah, I hope we didn't have I hope that everyone walks away from here not terrified about worms, or thinking now like I need to go to all my friends with a worm bin and tell them this is the worst thing you could be doing, you're ruining the forest. Definitely not what we were trying to, the point we were trying to get across, but just wanted to open up the discussion so maybe you could be equally afraid of all worms, not just
You
point to
know,
one.
yeah, exactly. Here's a treat for the very end since you extended it, and I probably should have said it earlier. So for those who are going to be watching at the end, one reason I didn't bring this up actually was because I think for the Asian jumping worm in particular, this is not true, which I really wish it was more true, I think. But I think composting, maybe thermophilic in particular, actually is able to destroy them. But
Mhm.
the earthworms, they call them cocoons. They're not really cocoons, they're egg capsules or whatever. Um, Taxonomy is weird, but they can be destroyed through processing like compost. And I think thermophilic in particular, maybe not jumping worms, but other exotics or whatever, could be affected negatively. And Keisha's right. Like if it's not an environment that they're enjoying, they can leave if they can, or if they can't, maybe they get sick or they get injured and they get recycled too. So that's the point I wanted to make, was that like I think there are ways people can maybe process at home, and take measures to at least not add to the conflagration. So, and I really appreciate people being interested. It is actually specifically that gives me sort of endearing hope. So thanks for people asking the question for these impetus.
Before we sign off, I tried to do it earlier, but somehow Raleigh's account has me blocked out of commenting to everyone. But
Oh,
can
yeah.
you, Matthew, put your contact, your website? Matthew has so many different places that you can access his knowledge, and it's such a great deal to sign up for his monthly program on, which is it Patreon that you use, Matthew?
But yeah, that's right. I do have a Patreon. A few over 100 people who come talk about IPM, ask questions. If you want like a IPM support in your pocket and you're just some person gardening or doing whatever, as little as $1 a month. I don't try to charge too much for it. I also professionally do IPM. If you have professional inquiries, you can check me out at zenthanol.com. And then I make a lot of educational videos, less lately, but that will be changing soon, at zenthanol.com. I'm sorry, at youtube.com/zenthanol. So same name. And I really appreciate it. And I look forward to our mutual success.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you,
And
Matthew.
thank you everyone for joining. We will have this. There's a few questions. Where will you find the recording? It will be in your email. If you are in this group, you have signed up for our email list. So we're going to have probably 3 or 4 more of these where we bring on different guest speakers during our promotional period. So you'll be hearing from us with emails informing you of those. And then also, yeah, all of our recordings will come through your email so you can watch. And if something doesn't come through, it's all of our names, Keisha, Brian, Casey, Raleigh at compost.academy, and just poke us and say, send us the video and we will. So thank you
Excellent.
so much for joining. We appreciate you all so much. Thank you, Matthew. Can't wait to have you on again. That was so much fun.
That was a blast. Yeah. Good job. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I think at this point we'll call it a wrap.
Yeah,
So
that's good.
we'll see you on the next promotional webinars.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.